The night was not black. It was a deep, suffocating blue, a bruise pressed against the earth. And from this bruise, on a scrap of land chewed by tank treads and artillery, a faint, feverish glow pulsed. The airfield. Senior Lieutenant Lidiya Litvyak did not walk to her aircraft. She moved through the darkness with the grim precision of a surgeon approaching an operating table. Her world had contracted to a series of tangible, cold facts. The rough wool of her uniform against her skin, the sharp, frozen scent of pine and damp soil, the distant, never-ending bass rumble of the front, a sound felt in the teeth more than heard. Her U-2 waited. It looked absurdly fragile in the gloom, a skeletal insect of canvas and plywood. A young mechanic, face a pale smudge under a fur hat, materialized from the dark. She didn't speak. She simply looked at Lydia and touched her own shoulder, then pointed to the aircraft's engine cowling. A gesture from their silent language. I've checked it. It's holding, for now. Lydia responded with a slow, deliberate blink. Understood. The ritual was sacred because its price was death. Lydia's hands ran over the cold skin of the fuselage, not a caress, but a diagnostic. A frayed wire here, patched with tape. A fresh, jagged hole in the fabric from 2 nights prior, stitched up like a wound. This was not a machine of war. It was a chronicle of close calls, a flying testimony of survival measured in patches and prayers. The command dugout was a coffin of damp wood and map paper. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and cold sweat. The regimental commander, her face looking carved from the same granite as the front lines, didn't use a pointer. She stabbed the map with a thick, calloused finger. Here. The nail tapped a point far behind the serpentine wound of the front line. Grid reference 47K. Not a supply depot. An artery. Her voice was a low, gravel whisper, forcing everyone to lean in, to drown out the thump of artillery. The 11th Panzer is a fist. This, the finger jabbed again, is the nerve that makes the fist clench. Artillery shells for their barrage. Tank rounds for the breakthrough. Fuel drums. All of it. Stacked and waiting. She looked up, her eyes scanning the faces of the few pilots gathered. They weren't looking for bravery. They were checking for comprehension. For the cold, hard light of understanding. Our intelligence is precise. Their attack jumps off at 0530. Objective. The high ground at Sokol Ridge, currently held by our 42nd Rifle Division. The 42nd is exhausted. They are under strength. They have 12 hours to prepare, but the German barrage will start at 04:00. If that ammunition at 47K reaches their guns, the 42nd will be erased from that ridge, wiped clean. A chill that had nothing to do with the draft seeped into the dugout. This wasn't a target. It was a verdict. The commander's gaze settled on Lydia. Litviak, you have the lead. Your flight's objective is to sever that artery. You don't damage it. You don't harass it. You destroy it. You turn that grid square into a crater. The math is simple. She paused, letting the numbers hang in the stale air. 1 depot destroyed equals no barrage. No barrage equals 12 more hours for the 42nd to dig in. 12 hours equals a fighting chance. A chance equals lives. Thousands of them. Your bombs are the only variable in this equation. Lydia felt the weight settle in her stomach, dense and cold as a stone. It was not the weight of honor, but of a terrible, precise arithmetic. She wasn't carrying explosives. She was carrying a balance. On one side, the fragile lives of the 42nd. On the other, her skill, her luck, the flimsy frame of her U-2. Back in the freezing air, the reality of the equation crystallized. Her navigator, a sharp-faced woman named Galina, was already in the rear cockpit, her silhouette hunched over the luminescent dial of a chart light. No words. Galina simply held up 2 fingers, then pointed east. 2 minutes to engine start. Lydia climbed into the forward cockpit. The leather seat was ice. The controls were familiar, extensions of her own nervous system. Her hands performed the pre-flight check autonomously, throttle friction lock, fuel valve, magnetos. But her mind was elsewhere. It was already over the lines, navigating the dark, hunting for that single crucial point on the map that held the power of a divisional slaughter or salvation. Before her, tucked into a narrow map case, was a personal token, not a photo. A single dry-pressed cornflower, its blue almost black in the low light. It was from her last summer before the war, a field near her hometown, a memory of a world that was warmth and silence. Her ritual was not to look at it for luck, but to acknowledge its existence, to remember what she was calculating for, the simplicity that was on the other side of this brutal math. A shadow moved by the propeller, the mechanic, a raised thumb. Lydia took a breath that burned her lungs with cold. She pulled her goggles down. The world became a smaller, clearer circle. Contact! The mechanic swung the prop. The engine coughed, spluttered a protest of freezing oil and metal, then caught. The sound was not a roar, but a frantic, persistent rattle, the desperate heartbeat of the night. The whole airframe shook, a living creature trembling with anticipation and dread. They taxied, bouncing violently over the frozen ruts of the grassland. The only lights were the faint blue exhaust flames from the plane ahead, will-o'-the-wisps leading into the abyss. Ahead, the darkness was absolute, a wall. At the runway's end, Lydia turned into the wind. She looked at her instruments, a constellation of faint green dots in the dark. She looked at the cornflower, a blur of darkness in its case. Then she closed the case. She advanced the throttle. The U-2, burdened by its deadly cargo, strained against the earth. For a terrifying second, it refused, wheels sticking in the mud. Then, with a shudder that ran from the propeller hub to the tip of the tail, it surrendered to the air. The ground fell away, the few dim lights of the field vanishing as if swallowed. Now there was only the all-consuming darkness, the rattling scream of the engine, and the biting, thousand-needle wind. Below, the world was a void. Occasional flashes, silent from this height, lit the cloud base like a diseased, flickering heartbeat. The front. Lidiya Litvyak, a dot of consciousness in a frozen, roaring cage of fabric and fear, set her course. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a mathematician of consequences, flying her fragile craft into the dark, carrying the cold, terrible numbers of the equation that would decide whether a ridge and the men upon it would see the dawn. The darkness was a partner. It was the blanket that hid them, the sea they swam through. For 27 minutes, it was the only truth. The engine's rattle was a mantra, the freezing wind, a familiar scourge. Lydia's world was the dim green glow of the altimeter, the faint silhouette of Galina's head in the rear cockpit, and the map etched onto the back of her eyelids. Grid 47K, the artery, the equation. They crossed the front. The void beneath them came alive, not with lights, but with deeper textures of black, the jagged scars of trenches, the ominous, smooth pools of flooded shell holes reflecting starless sky. The distant, soundless flashes were behind them now. Here the darkness was total, awaiting silence. Then, the world ended. It did not begin with a warning. There was no distant searchlight beam probing the clouds. One moment, there was the intimate rushing black of the cockpit. The next, whump, a physical blow of pure white silence. A wall of light materialized from nothing, directly ahead, so immense it had no edges. It wasn't a beam. It was a solid state of being. It erased the cockpit, the instruments, Galina, her own hands on the controls. It erased Lidiya Litvyak. It filled her goggles, her skull, her lungs with a scalding chemical whiteness. She was not illuminated. She was dissected. Every stitch on the wing, every patch on the fuselage was thrown into razor-sharp, obscene detail. They were no longer flying. They were a specimen pinned to a table of light. Instinct, older than fear, made her shove the stick forward. The U-2's nose dropped. The engine's rattle became a scream of strain. But the light was alive. It tracked. It clung to them with the malevolent intelligence of a predator. It wasn't just one. From below, from the sides, other beams stabbed upward, weaving a cage of brilliance. They were caught in a cathedral of light, and they were the sacrifice. Sound returned, not from outside, but from within her own body. A high, thin whine in her ears that was her terror, given frequency. Then the outside world crashed back in. Crump, crump, crump. The first flak bursts were not explosions of fire, but of black smoke and raw concussion in the pristine white. They erupted around them, close enough to feel the heat slap against the canvas skin. The plane bucked like a spooked animal. The shudder ran up the controls and into Lydia's bones. "Galina!" Her own voice, raw and strange in her ears, a violation of the silent pact. A flash, brighter than the searchlights, to their port side. A bloom of orange and black. The sound reached them a millisecond later, a deep, wet thump that shook the air. One of the other U-2s. Gone. Just like that. Erased from the equation. A new sound, a vicious, tearing rattle. Machine guns, tracers, lazy and hypnotic at first, then accelerating into frantic, glowing rivers that curved up through the light box, seeking them. They were no longer hunters. They were prey in a shooting gallery. A hammer blow hit the aircraft. Not a concussion, but a localized, savage punch from below. The floor between Lydia's feet jumped. A spray of something hot and wet hit her cheek. Oil. The engine's scream pitched higher, then faltered, choked. A cloud of acrid, blue-gray smoke vomited from the cowling, whipped back into the cockpit, stinging her eyes. "Left engine, oil pressure 0." Galina's voice, crackling through the intercom, was a clinical report from the edge of the abyss. Lydia fought the stick. The plane was listing, dying. The searchlights held them, unwavering. They were a dying bug under a microscope. Then came the shard. It arrived with no sound of its own. A piece of the sky, of the light, made solid. It punched through the windshield on Galina's side with a crystalline pop. Not a hole. A sudden intricate web of fractures. A sliver of it, a needle of frozen light, sliced across the space between the cockpits and buried itself in Lydia's right shoulder, with a blunt, sickening thud. The pain was not immediate. It was an explosion of pure signal that bypassed nerves and went straight to her brainstem. White, not from the lights, from within. Her right arm went numb. Then it ignited. A fire of acid and ice that locked the muscles, that seared into the bone. Her hand spasmed open. The stick jerked forward from her failing grip. The U-2 nosedived into its own shadow. The world inverted. The cage of light became a tunnel, then a single shrinking square of white above them. The roar of the wind became a shriek. The instrument panel was a blur of meaningless dials. G-force pressed her into the seat, then tried to pull her out through the shattered windshield. The pain in her shoulder was a screaming anchor, tying her to the plunging metal. Somewhere, beneath the pain, beneath the terror, a cold, small calculator was still running. Engine dead. Controls heavy. Altitude vanishing. Light above. Dark below. Her left hand, her good hand, clawed across her body. Fingers, clumsy with cold and shock, found the throttle. Rammed it closed. Killed the shuddering, dying scream of the engine. Silence, except for the howl of the wind. She pulled. Not with her right arm. That was a slab of meat on fire. But with her entire body, her back, her legs, a guttural cry tearing from her throat as the movement jarred the metal in her shoulder. The stick resisted, fought her. Then inch by agonizing inch it yielded. The dizzying spiral shallowed. The square of light above slid to the side, then was gone. They fell now in a steep, silent glide. The searchlight beams, baffled, stabbed the empty space where they had been, then began to wander, to lose interest. Darkness rushed back in. But it was a different darkness. It was the darkness after a storm. It was wounded. It smelled of smoke, hot metal, and the sharp coppery tang of her own blood, warm inside her flight suit. The wind through the shattered glass was a cold knife on her face. Lydia gasped, sucking in the freezing, smoky air. Each breath grated against the pain. She looked down. A dark, glossy stain was spreading across the leather of her jacket, absorbing the faint green light of the instruments. The shrapnel shard was there, just below her collarbone, a ugly, protruded lump, a piece of the sky she had brought down with her. She tried to move her right fingers. A faint, distant twitch answered. Useless. Behind her, Galina was alive. She could hear her shifting, coughing. But there were no words. The silence between them now was not of ritual. It was the silence of survivors in a shattered shell, plummeting through the night towards an unknown earth. The arithmetic of their mission replaced by the simple, brutal calculus of the next 60 seconds. The target, the artery, the equation, all of it was above them now, in that lost world of light. They had failed. All they had left was the fall. The fall was not a plunge. It was a slow, irreversible sinking. A stone dropped into a well of ink. The only sound was the wind, a low, grieving moan through the shattered windshield and the ragged holes in the wings. It was a colder sound now, bereft of the engine's heat. It spoke of emptiness, of terminus. Lydia's world had narrowed to a tunnel. At its end, the blurred, dancing instruments. In the center, the white-hot forge of pain in her shoulder, beating in time with her heart. Each throb sent a bright, sickening wave down her arm and up her neck. The shrapnel was no longer a piece of metal. It was a fact, a new, terrible constant in her personal equation. She could feel the sluggish, uncooperative response of the controls. The U-2 was a wounded bird, one wing heavy, fighting her left hand's every command. She flew by instinct and grim compensation, her body tilted in the seat, her good arm trembling with the strain of keeping the nose level. The altimeter unwound its numbers with quiet, mechanical indifference. 2,000 meters, 1,800. A click in her headset. Then Galina's voice, stripped of all tone, flat and crackling with static. Navigation is gone. Instruments damaged. I have visual on ground references. We are approximately 8 kilometers south-southwest of the primary target. The words were coordinates on a death certificate. South-southwest. The wrong direction. They had been blown off course in the storm of light and metal. The depot, the artery, was now to their north, an impossible distance. Airspeed falling, Galina continued, the reporter of their demise. Glide ratio degrading. Maximum possible range, 4 kilometers, maybe 5. Lydia's eyes, squinted against the wind and pain, scanned the void below. Then she saw it, not with her eyes but on the map in her mind, superimposed on the darkness. They were gliding towards a patch of forest, a minor river bend. Nowhere. A place to disappear, to crash, to be captured, or to die on impact. Failure was a taste of iron and oil in her mouth, sharper than blood. Another click. A longer pause. Galina's voice changed. A faint, brittle thread of something, not hope, but recognition, entered it. I have a visual. A ground flare, green, to the northeast. Lydia's head jerked, a spike of fresh agony. She strained her eyes. There, a pinprick of emerald light, far on the horizon, burning for a few seconds before being swallowed by the dark. A signal. From whom? A partisan cell? A stranded reconnaissance team? It didn't matter. It was a point. A datum in the nothingness. And then, as if triggered by the flare, a deeper glow began to pulse on the very edge of that same horizon. A soft, orange blush. Not the sharp flash of artillery, but the steady, feverish burn of something large on fire. The depot, their target, the nerve center of the German fist. It was burning. A sudden, violent memory assaulted her, the hammer blow to their aircraft, the spray of oil. Her own bombs. In her evasive dive, she had jettisoned them early, wildly. One of them, by blind, chaotic chance, must have found the target's periphery. She hadn't destroyed the artery. She had nicked it, wounded it. The glow was a testament not to her skill, but to random fortune. It was a taunt. The equation reformed in her mind, brutal and clear. On one side, the depot, wounded but functional, still pumping shells and fuel to the 11th Panzer. Enough for the barrage. Enough to erase the 42nd Division from Sokol Ridge. On the other side, her own life and Galina's. A crash landing in the dark. Capture. Interrogation. A bullet in a damp forest, or a slow death in a prison camp. A zero. A subtraction from the Soviet order of battle. A small, forgettable line in a German report. The numbers did not balance. They screamed in their imbalance. Her gaze locked onto the soft, evil glow to the northeast. The wind howled its one note. The pain in her shoulder was a clarion call, insisting on its own primacy, on survival. But Lidiya Litvyak was a mathematician trained for total war. And in that moment, she saw a third variable. One that had not been in the original briefing. One that existed outside of standard logistics and flight manuals. The variable was her aircraft itself. The U-2 was no longer a bomber. It was a glider, a guided projectile. Its bombs were gone, its guns were useless, its fuel was bleeding out, but it had mass, it had velocity. It had her at the controls. The burning depot was not just a glow, it was a beacon, the ultimate ground flare. A new calculation, cold and monstrous in its simplicity, executed itself behind her eyes. If she turned towards the glow, into the wind coming from that direction, she could extend the glide. She could use the dying craft's remaining kinetic energy, guide its entire weight, the engine, the frame, the two living souls inside it, not as a delivery system, but as the payload. The equation recalibrated. One U-2 bomber, written off, plus 1 pilot, mortally wounded, plus 1 navigator, equals 1 final precise impact, equals the complete destruction of primary target ammo depot 47K, equals the cancellation of the enemy artillery barrage, equals 12 hours for the 42nd Rifle Division, equals thousands of lives. The balance tipped, catastrophically, irreversibly. It was not a suicide impulse. It was not rage or despair. It was the opposite of chaos. It was the final, logical conclusion of the mission, the only way to solve for X, when all other coefficients had failed. She did not look back at Galena. She did not ask. To ask would be to share the burden, and this burden was hers alone to authorize. It was her plane, her command, her variable. Her left hand moved. Not a jerk, but a deliberate, firm pressure on the stiff controls. The U-2, groaning in its joints, began a slow, agonizing bank to the right, away from the dark forest and the empty river bend, towards the pulsing orange glow on the horizon. The wind's moan shifted pitch, now hitting them from a new angle. The glow grew from a smudge to a defined, flickering dome of light against the sky. A siren call written in fire. Lydia's right hand, the useless one, lay in her lap. With a monumental effort, she made her left hand release its death grip on the stick for just a second. She reached across her body, her fingers fumbling past the sticky warmth of her own blood, and found the small map case. She flicked the catch. The pressed cornflower, the blue from another world, was a dark shape inside. She did not take it out. She simply left the case open. Then her left hand returned to the stick, reclaiming its purpose. She adjusted the trim with her knee, fine-tuning the descent, aiming the bleeding, shuddering airframe like the last bullet in the chamber. She finally spoke. A single, calm, exhausted word into the intercom. Not an order, not an apology, but a simple statement of the new heading, the final destination. Correcting course. The world dissolved into a single fluid variable, the glide. Every ounce of Lydia's being, every shred of consciousness not shackled by pain, fused with the dying aircraft. The wind was no longer an enemy. It was a tangible river, and she was navigating its currents. The persistent, dull roar in her ears was the sound of potential energy bleeding into the night, and she was its accountant. The orange glow on the horizon ceased to be a distant fire. It resolved. It became a geography, a central, furious bonfire where her stray bomb must have struck a fuel cache, was surrounded by a constellation of smaller, sullen glows. Warehouses, ammunition stacks, shadows danced against the flickering light, the frantic, ant-like silhouettes of men trying to contain the disaster. The depot was wounded, bleeding fire, but its heart still beat. The arithmetic was clear. Chaos, not death. Her own pain had transformed. The fire in her shoulder was still there, a white noise scream. But it was compartmentalized, locked in a steel box at the back of her mind. Her focus was a physical beam, narrower and brighter than any searchlight, connecting her eyes to the growing inferno ahead. She calculated with a brutal, detached clarity. Airspeed, falling, but stable. Altitude, 1,800 meters. Distance to target, approximately 6 kilometers. Glide angle, shallow, but sufficient. Wind, a cross breeze from the west, pushing them slightly offline. Compensate with a 2-degree left rudder pressure. Use the knees, the hips. The body is part of the machine. Her left hand on the stick was an extension of the aircraft's nervous system. Tiny, imperceptible adjustments. A nudge to counter a gust. A gentle easing back to milk another few meters of lift from the dying wing. She was not flying the U-2. She was persuading it, coaxing its final cooperative act from its shattered frame. Behind her, silence. But it was a different silence now. It was dense. It was the silence of Galina performing her own final calculations. The rustle of charts was gone. No more updates on landmarks or wind drift. There was only the hiss of static in the headset and the shared, thunderous understanding of their new trajectory. No plea, no protest came over the intercom. Galina's acceptance was a tangible weight in the rear cockpit, a second set of hands, ghostly, on the controls, agreeing to the descent. Her silence was the final confirmation of the equation's logic. Lydia's eyes flickered down for a millisecond to the open map case. The cornflower was a stark, delicate silhouette against the dark leather. It was no longer a memory of a summer field. It was a symbol of the variable she was about to cancel out. Her own life, with all its past and its impossible future, was being factored down to zero. The simplicity of that flower was the antithesis of the complex roaring machine of war she was about to become a part of. She looked at it not with sorrow, but with a final, chilling acknowledgement. This is the cost. A new sensation intruded on her hyper-focused state. A faint prickling on the back of her neck, on her exposed cheeks. A dry chemical heat carried on the wind from 6 kilometers away. The smell of the depot reached them. Not smoke. The precursor. The acrid, nose-prickling scent of burning paint, heated metal, and something sweetly toxic. Incendiary chemicals. The target was breathing its poisoned breath towards them, pulling them in. The ground below began to surrender its anonymity. The uniform black splintered into textures. The dark velvet of dense forest, the charcoal smudge of a burned village, the dull metallic gleam of a river bend. They were landmarks on a approach path. She would never fly again. A sudden violent shudder racked the airframe. A sharp crack from the left wing. A structural member weakened by flak, finally yielding. The U-2 lurched, dropping a wing. Lydia's body reacted before her mind could process. A hard, instinctive shove of opposite rudder, a wrenching correction on the stick with her whole torso. A gasp tore from her lips as the movement ignited a nova of pain in her shoulder. For 3 terrible seconds, they were in a spiraling dive. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the soul of the aircraft, it stabilized. The glide was steeper now. Damaged. Less efficient. Recalibrate. The margin for error had vanished. The smooth, logical curve of their descent was now a ragged, desperate fall. The orange glow filled the windshield. No longer a point on the horizon, but a landscape. She could see the shapes of rectangular storage buildings, the zigzag patterns of earthen blast walls. The central fire was a swirling vortex of flame and smoke. Her mind executed the final targeting solution. Not the central fire. That was a natural inferno. She aimed for the largest, darkest shape adjacent to it. A long, low warehouse, still intact, its roof reflecting the hellish glow. The nerve cluster, where the shells would be stacked in rows, where the fuel drums would be lined up waiting. The impact needed to be a catalyst, not a addition. Her left hand tightened. Not in fear, in finality. She switched the intercom to transmit. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, rustling whisper, stripped of everything but imperative. "Galina, brace, on my mark." No response. Only a sharp, single intake of breath from the headset. The brace. Lydia's world telescoped, the instrument panel blurred. The wind's roar faded to a distant hum. The only things in perfect crystalline focus were the rectangular roof of the warehouse and the control stick in her hand. The connection between the two was a straight, unbreakable line of consequence. She stopped breathing. The ground rushed up, details exploding into clarity. Individual railway tracks, the corrugated pattern of a metal roof, the frantic scramble of tiny figures pointing upwards. She did not close her eyes. She did not think of the cornflower or her mother or the sky of a peaceful summer. She thought of the equation, the beautiful, terrible, perfect balance of it. Her final act as a pilot, as a mathematician of war, was a minor, precise adjustment of the elevators, flaring the nose up just a fraction, ensuring the airframe's entire mass, the engine block, the full fuel tanks, the 2 lives it carried, would strike not at a shallow angle but directly, maximizing transfer of kinetic energy. The warehouse roof filled the universe. There was no sound. There was only the solution. There was no impact. There was a cessation. One moment, there was the universe of the cockpit, the roar, the cold, the fire in her shoulder, the orange hell light flooding the glass, the absolute, tensile focus in her hands. The next, it all simply stopped being. There was no sound of tearing metal, no catastrophic crunch. Those are sensory experiences for the living, for observers. For Lidiya Litvyak, at the precise moment the equation reached its 0 point, there was only a silent, definitive, full stop. Then, not a flash, but an inversion. The world turned inside out. The darkness behind her eyes became a whiteness so profound it had no temperature, no dimension. It was the white of a clean chalkboard, the white of a fresh page, the white of a perfectly solved equation, all variables accounted for, leaving only this elegant, empty silence. In that whiteness, there was a single, suspended sensation. Release. The searing piano wire tension in her left shoulder, which had been the center of her being for the last 10 minutes, simply vanished. The weight of the controls, the strain in her back, the desperate grip of her hand, gone. It was not peace. It was the absence of resistance, the final, logical answer. The whiteness held for a timeless moment. And then, as if a switch were thrown somewhere in the heart of physics itself, it was replaced. Not by darkness, but by a pure and violent translation of energy. A wave of force, born from the precise point of cessation, radiated outwards. It was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was the universe itself flinching. A sphere of compressed air, hotter than the sun, moving faster than sound, vaporizing the U-2, the warehouse, the neat rows of artillery shells, the fuel drums, into a single, nascent star of plasma. This star existed for less than a second, but in that second, it wrote its conclusion across the night. The shock wave hit the ground first, not as a sound, but as a physical dislocation. The earth for 200 meters in every direction simply jumped, as if struck by a giant's hammer. Then it settled, not back, but down, into a perfect, smoking bowl. The sound arrived as an afterthought, a deep, fundamental thud that originated in the chests of every man for 10 kilometers. A bass note that shook the teeth in their skulls before it reached their ears. It was the sound of a mountain being unmade. Then came the light. It was not the light of the existing fires. It was a new dawn, born instantly at midnight. A climbing, roiling fist of yellow and orange that punched a hole through the smoke and the darkness, illuminating the undersides of clouds, casting stark, running silhouettes of men and machines for a kilometer around. For 1 second, the landscape was as bright and sharp as noon, And then came the secondary orchestra. It began as a tympanic roll, the sympathetic detonation of stacked munitions. Shells cooked off in their racks, not in a single blast, but in a rapid, stuttering crescendo of flashes and concussions that marched through the remains of the depot. Canisters of fuel answered with deeper, whooshing roars, sending pillars of fire twisting into the sky. The initial perfect star of energy shattered into a chaotic, brilliant fireworks of annihilation. The ammunition depot, Grid 47K, the logistical artery of the 11th Panzer Division, did not just explode. It underwent a process of rapid, total, and irreversible decomposition. What had taken months to assemble was disassembled into its constituent atoms in less than a minute. 8 kilometers away, in a forward observation post dug into the side of Sokol Ridge, a lieutenant of the 42nd Rifle Division flinched as the false dawn lit up the western horizon. He raised his binoculars. For a long minute he watched the continuous, rolling inferno. He lowered the glasses, a strange emptiness on his smoke-stained face. He picked up a field telephone. "Forward observer to command. The fireworks in the west, at the estimated German depot coordinates. It's not a bombardment. It's a systemic detonation. The entire sector is lighting up. It's gone. Whatever it was, it's all gone." A crackle on the line. A tired voice. "Confirm observation." The lieutenant looked again at the beautiful, terrible firestorm. "Confirmed. The enemy's ammunition supply for the planned barrage has just been subtracted from the battlefield." Back at the airfield of the Night Witches, the first gray fingers of dawn were touching the eastern horizon. The commander stood outside her dugout, a cold cup of tea forgotten in her hand, staring at the distant, pulsating glow that outshone the coming sun. No planes had returned from the sortie. The radio silence was absolute. A young radio operator, her face pale, emerged and handed her a decoded slip of paper. It was from partisan intelligence, relayed through 3 stations. Observed catastrophic explosion at German depot grid 47K at 0247. Total destruction. Cause unknown. No aircraft seen leaving area. Firestorm ongoing. The commander stared at the paper, then at the glow. She knew the flight path. She knew the glide capabilities of a stricken U-2. She performed the calculation in her head, the last piece of the equation falling into place with a quiet, devastating click. She didn't think of heroism. She thought of mathematics, of a variable so committed to balance that it had chosen to become a constant. She looked up at the lightning sky where her pilots had vanished. Her voice, when she finally spoke to the empty airfield, was flat, with the weight of a solved problem. "The equation is balanced." She turned and walked back to her maps. The dawn was coming. The 42nd Division on Sokol Ridge had their 12 hours. The war had its outcome paid for in a currency beyond rubles or medals. Paid for with a single, flawless terminal calculation in the dark.